And so what I observe is that instead of this being a real unity movement, it is instead a fellowship movement.
Well, Mr. Hires, when I heard that Getwell was shutting their doors,
yes,
and I saw you on the lectureship, I said I have to come and try to talk to Alan Hires. I think that everybody will have different things to attach your name to. They will think debates, they'll think spiritual sword editor, Freed-Hardening Open Forum, or they'll know you were a judge. There is so much in your history that people don't know. And so I'm 30 years old, and I would like for you to be able to fill in some blanks on these stories for my generation.
All right.
What people don't know about you is that the Memphis School of Preaching did not actually begin as the Memphis School of Preaching, but instead it started in 1966 with you as the director.
That's correct.
Now, how did that happen?
There was a teacher in the Harding Graduate School at that time that was saying some things that troubled some of us. And we began to talk about what could be done. Charles Coyle was the preacher in West Memphis. He and I were friends. And the two of us talked about what we could do to have a teaching program for preachers that would not involve questionable positions. And we read about the school they had out in Lubbock. We didn't know much about it, but we knew it was a school by a congregation to train preachers. So we began to think about having a school like that here. Unknown to us, Greg Avenue Church in Memphis was talking to Brother Hearn, and they were talking about establishing a school. So when they found out that Getwell was interested, they invited us to a meeting. So there was a meeting between the Greg Avenue elders and the Getwell elders. Brother Hearn was present, I was present, and the Greg Avenue elders said Getwell is in a much stronger position than we are to have a school, and we defer to the Getwell congregation. So that is the beginning. Brother Hearn was very interested in the school, and he was brought on board to travel and to recruit students and to generate support for the school. I became the first director of the school, and all of the first teachers were brought on board by me. The curriculum was established by me. I had notes at one time in my own handwriting of all the classes that would be offered. And the school began in that situation. And Brother Hearn did not become director until later in the fall. I was preaching full-time at Getwell, and it was thought that he would have more time to devote to being director of the school, but he was not the first director.
Right. Well, how I read this book. This is the biography of B.C. Goodpasture.
Yes.
Roy Hearn seemed to be very set on having a school in Nashville with B.C. How is it that he ended up coming to Getwell?
Well, I don't know about the Nashville situation. He was at Freed-Hardeman at one time, Brother Hearn was. And his wife was from Memphis. And the first connection I had with him was through Greg Avenue.
Okay.
They had talked to him, or he had talked to them about the possibility of establishing a school.
Okay. One of the things, do you remember Glenn Wallace? He was Foy's nephew.
Yes, I knew Glenn.
Okay, he wrote in the Gospel Advocate at about 69 or 70, and he just said, the way you said, there was questionable things coming out of Harding Graduate. And Glenn Wallace, he just said there's a deficiency in all of our Bible faculties. Is that how you felt then?
Not necessarily. We were more concerned with the local situation,
Okay.
how things were in Memphis,
And that
what we could do about it.
Okay. Well, he had said that, and
Glenn Wallace and G.K. Wallace were brothers.
okay. Now I didn't know their relationship, but he wrote openly that there was a deficiency, and now that things have become so spread out beyond locally just at Getwell, it's all of Memphis School of Preaching, and there are other School of Preachings. With the schools of preaching now and the Bible faculties that we have now in the colleges, what would you think that Glenn Wallace's statement is still accurate today, that we still have a deficiency?
I don't know that I would apply it to every school.
Okay.
I think there are 2 or 3 schools that have drifted further and further to the left.
Right. And would that be Pepperdine?
Pepperdine, Abilene, and now Lipscomb.
And one of the things that I would like to talk about with the Memphis school, and then that was 1966. One of the things that you did in 1968, you participated in the Arlington meeting. My generation doesn't know about the Arlington meeting, but that was a collection of men that were going to have back and forth about the non-institutional discussion. So when they were doing that, do you think that we need to have, like, if the schools are drifting, should we have something akin to an Arlington meeting where we try to pull things back?
Well, it might be a good idea, but I'm not sure you could get much participation.
From either side?
Well, from the schools.
Okay.
I think some of the schools are determined to go the direction they have gone. And I'm not sure they would be receptive to any effort to pull them back.
Well, even if it wasn't the schools, the personalities that you were with, you were 30 years old in 1968 doing the Arlington meeting, and you were there with Reuel Lemmons, Jimmy Allen, but from the other side was Roy Cogdell, Harry Pickup Jr., and a handful of others. Roy Cogdell was historically known for being pretty rough.
What you have to understand about the Arlington meeting, today, members of the church scarcely know who the non-institutional people are. There's almost no connection. But at the time of the Arlington meeting, that was still a very lively issue in the church. And there were churches that were being split and divided over what they call the institutional question. So the Arlington meeting was an effort for the 2 sides to get together and to have a frank discussion. And it was a very good meeting, I might add. I was probably the youngest person there. And I remember I made a speech out there during that meeting, and the other side was very receptive to what I had to say. And when we got to the end of the meeting, Reuel Lemmons, who more or less was the captain on our side of the question, said to me, "They like you, so I'd like for you to close the meeting." And I spoke again at the end. Roy Cogdell was the leader on the other side. He was very gracious to me. For example, I had a debate on the institutional question in Corinth, Mississippi, with a man named Earl Bingham. Franklin Puckett was a leading member of the non-institutional group. He attended that debate, which I didn't even know. But he told Roy Cogdell that I made the strongest defense of our position that he had ever heard. And I thought it was gracious of Cogdell that he told that to me.
That is very gracious.
Because I'm surprised that he would divulge that.
Mm-hmm.
But he said, Franklin Puckett told me that you made the strongest defense of your position of anyone he'd ever heard.
Well, also for being able to debate you and then go away and admit what your strong suit was. I think that's very good of him to even share that with Cogdell. Do you think people, they'll hear us now and they'll think of the Arlington meeting and the debates? You're sitting right now. You have had a number of debates. You are from the time frame where we're having debates all over the place. Do we need them now?
Debates would be helpful if you had representative men. Taking it away from the institutional question for a moment. We used to have many debates with the Baptists about baptism, apostasy, the church. One reason you don't have those today is there are no Baptist debaters. At one time you had the famous old debater Ben Bogard, who debated Hardeman and Warlake and many of our outstanding men of days gone by. He died in the 50s. I debated two of the men that were trained by Bogard. A man named Albert Garner, who, by the way, was a graduate of Harding College, and a man named Hoyt Chastain, who I was told was Bogard's handpicked successor as a debater. At any rate, I debated both of them. They were both trained by Bogard. But nowadays, you don't have any Baptist debaters. For a long time, you've not had any Methodist debaters. So, one reason you don't have debates today is you don't really have representative men. Ben Bogard had over 20 debates with Joe S. Warlake. One man.
Right.
They'd go into a community and hold a debate. Maybe there'd be a gospel meeting or something that would stir up the local people. And one side or the other would challenge for a debate. And they'd call in these representatives that were experienced debaters. And you'd have a debate between Joe S. Warlake and Ben M. Bogard. By the way, there's an interesting story. Bogard debated so many of our brethren. Someone asked him, who do you consider the best debater you ever met? And this was Bogard's answer. And I've been told this by two different people who talked to him. He said, the best logician is C.R. Nickel. He said, the best man at taking an audience away from you is G.C. Brewer. The best at repartee is Joe S. Warlake. And the best all-around debater is N.B. Hardeman. That was Bogard's answer about who the best debaters were that he ever met.
It's very interesting in what you're saying, for him to be paying so much attention and making those type of notes. So one question they don't have too many representatives, is what you're saying. For us and members of the church, gospel preachers, one thing that I have seen, and you tell me what you think about local congregations. If a local man said he was going to rise up, this is what I have noticed, if he's going to rise up and he's going to debate a local Methodist, he almost gets shut down by his own brethren because someone says, now wait a minute, that's my cousin, and you're about to wreck Thanksgiving. Do you think that plays a role in why we don't have as many debates? Well, the local pressures?
I don't know whether anybody's related to the debaters on the other side, but I do think there's a spirit of toleration that did not exist years ago. There was a time that if somebody taught error, if somebody taught false doctrine, it was not considered uncouth to expose that.
Right.
But as time has gone on, people have become more and more tolerant of error, false teaching, and especially false teachers. And nobody wants to offend anybody.
Right.
And so for that reason, there's less conflict.
Well, even in your sermon that you preached this morning in the Getwell congregation, you named a number of denominational names and their founders. I don't hear a lot of preachers naming names anymore.
No.
Like if they call out a denominational name, they're expecting they're going to get in trouble with the local congregation. Is that a problem?
Possible.
Okay, but would you think that we need to get back to, if we don't name the names of denominations, then these people can't know what their problem is? Do we need more of it?
Well, one thing you have to realize, look at how many churches of Christ over the past 10 years or so have committed to an instrumental service. They may have a non-instrumental service as well, or they may just go instrumental. But a lot of that is because there are no debates, there is no conflict, and I venture to say that many congregations have not heard a sermon on why we do not use instrumental music in maybe 30 to 40 years.
And that was one of your debates with Given Blakely.
Yes.
And you debated that whole issue.
Right.
And again, to what you said, where we are, I've talked to a number of the Christian church preachers. They don't want to debate. So in that time, I think it was 1988.
But at one time they did.
Right. And I wish that they would.
But part of that is a difference in their attitude toward the Bible. Back years ago, they believed in Bible authority, and they tried to prove instrumental music by the scriptures. As time has gone by, that has become passé with them.
Right.
And they're not so much interested anymore in Bible authority. One man in the church with a PhD made the statement, the main argument for instrumental music is we want it and we're going to have it. And he may be right.
Well, the way that you said, that's how my generation is, because we're not getting to have the debates. So most of the people...
And you're not hearing any sermons on it.
No.
There's very little teaching that's been done on it.
So would you say the debates would help the Christian church, but because we're not getting to have them, it's actually hurting us that we're not getting to have the education process?
I think so. I think, for example, you look at the churches that have adopted the instrument. They're in the minority, no question about it. Someone has estimated, I don't know if these figures are correct, that only about 20 congregations out of a total of 12,000 congregations have accepted the instrument. But the difference is the 20 congregations, for the most part, who have accepted the instrument are large metropolitan churches. So they exert an influence greater than maybe anybody else.
Mm-hmm. And that's what I would have seen in my research, is some of the larger metropolitan areas, like you said. Well, one of those things that you said is there's no conflict. So one historical thing that I wanted to talk with you about was the 1973 Memphis meeting. From what I have found,
it was held in this building.
Oh, yes, sir. And it lasted till 12:30 at night with about over 200 preachers.
And I don't remember exactly how that came about. I hate to tell you that because that may be one of your questions, but...
Having it in the building or the meeting itself?
The meeting.
Okay, well...
I can't remember how we happened to have that meeting. It had to do with the Herald of Truth.
Yes, sir.
And Bachelor Barry Baxter was here.
Yes.
My friend Lynn Anderson was here. He made a statement during that meeting that I think probably came back to haunt him. He referred to the church as a big, sick denomination, and that followed him the rest of his life. But why we had the meeting or how it came about, I don't actually recall.
Well, most of the research that I've been able to do is through Contending for the Faith, 1973, and a handful of other papers. From what I had read, they requested a meeting. They didn't necessarily know that so many people were going to show up, but they were having the charge. Do you remember? A lot of it revolved around charismatic ideas, speaking in tongues at Highland.
Yeah, that was a problem at one time.
So, can you explain, for my generation, when I say Herald of Truth was huge. Can you tell? Like, give a picture for how big Herald of Truth was.
Well, Herald of Truth was our only national radio program and later TV program. And it was begun by James D. Williford and James Walter Nichols. They were two established preachers, and they were interested in having a national program. And they were the early speakers on the program. But it was a program that went all over the country. It was a matter of pride, I think, to a lot of congregations to have a program of that kind. Churches supported it. And as you know, you mentioned the anti-institutional movement. They objected to Herald of Truth, particularly the way it was financed. They did not believe in church cooperation in the field of evangelism. They believed you could have church cooperation in benevolence, but not in evangelism. And that was their position that they advocated. And at one time, that was a very serious issue.
When you were having the Memphis meeting, the primary speakers were yourself, Garland Elkins, and Thomas Warren. Y'all did most of the speaking from what I could find. When we're talking about the non-institutional movement, when y'all were having the Memphis meeting in 1973, did you ever feel like that the non-institutional folk were going to say, "I told you so"? It had become so big, and y'all were having to challenge it.
I don't know whether that entered my mind or not.
Okay.
The non-institutional people at one time were called antis, and they objected to that terminology, and that's why they became known as the NIs, the non-institutional brethren, in order to get away from a term that they objected to. But they, on the other hand, referred to us as the liberals.
Right.
And they didn't soften their vocabulary.
Not at all. When y'all were having that meeting, one thing that for my generation, that I think would be very helpful, there were 3 national broadcasting groups back then. Herald of Truth was on 2 of them. I believe it for sure was NBC and then possibly ABC. And they were on over 400 radio stations. It was massive. A lot of times today, inside of the Brotherhood, different ministries will come about, and when they kind of start to move in a not good direction, what someone will say is, "Well, it's too big to fail, so we can't do anything about it." That type of thinking did not stop y'all. It was the biggest, and y'all still felt, we need to challenge this. We're not seeing that. I don't think that we're seeing that mindset today. That if something's too big, then it becomes almost holy. But when you all did that, it was creating tensions across the board.
Yes.
For Thomas...
See, it's hard for the modern generation to understand divisions that we have confronted in the past. For example, you haven't mentioned this, but there was a time when a substantial number of congregations opposed having Bible classes. There was a time that some congregations opposed individual drinking vessels for the fruit of the vine in the Lord's Supper. They were called one-cuppers. Hardly anybody knows anything about that group anymore. They've disappeared into the woodwork. And the same virtually has occurred with the anti-institutional group. They oppose church cooperation in the Herald of Truth and in any evangelistic effort. And at one time, the preachers of that persuasion were still holding gospel meetings for churches that did not agree with them. But as time went by, the separation has become more vivid. Mm-hmm. And so today, the average member of the church has no idea who the non-institutional brethren are, and they have no connection with them whatsoever.
Right.
But it was a big issue.
It was big
at one time.
It was huge.
It caused a lot of division.
The way that you said that of there would be this disagreement, but they'd keep holding these meetings together. Do you think that
they did for a while?
Was that confusing to everybody?
Well, the problem became that the men that we call non-institutional, they couldn't leave the issue alone. For example, I was told about a congregation in Florence, Alabama, where that one of these non-institutional preachers came to hold a meeting. He'd held meetings there before. They thought a lot of him. But they knew the position that he held during the last meeting, so the elders met with him and said, "We're glad you're here. We look forward to the meeting, but we do not want you to discuss these questions of church cooperation." My understanding is he agreed to it, but during one of his sermons, he just couldn't resist.
It came out anyway.
It came out.
Yeah.
And one of the elders in the congregation got up, walked to the front, preacher standing there in the pulpit, elder stood before the microphone. He said, "This meeting has come to a close. Let us pray." And he issued a dismissal prayer, and the meeting was over. But that illustrates, I think, what happened with that movement.
Right.
They became so obsessed with those issues. I've described that movement as the division that should have never been. Because before it became such an issue, there are always brethren who held to those views. But they still worked together. They held meetings together. They just didn't participate in something they thought was wrong. My thought was, if these men could do this year after year after year, work together, even though they held different views on the question, why did there have to be a division? But it was so pressed by the time the division came about that they could not be pacified.
Well, what would you, so this is the Arlington meeting, and that is actually how you closed the whole meeting. Your side of the meeting was, you issued over to them and you said, "We're not asking you to support the institution, and we're fine that you say it's something you believe to be incorrect. Why can't you keep extending fellowship to us?" So what would you say to someone like Don DeWelt? Because when you debated Given Blakely, Don DeWelt was there, and that was his position. He said, Alan Hires doesn't have to use the piano, and he can even say that it's wrong, but he ought to be able to fellowship with me. So if anybody in my generation read this book, and then they read your debate with Given Blakely, what would you say to them as to why that the antis could fellowship with us and not do it, but we can't fellowship Don DeWelt and not do it, the piano?
Instrumental music, pretty much in a different category, because it involved the whole congregation. I could attend a congregation that supported orphan homes, even if I were opposed. I could direct my contribution elsewhere. But instrumental music affected the whole church.
Right.
And that was the difference primarily. that you could have unity with some people who were opposed to certain aspects of the work, and they didn't have to participate in it. But if you move the piano or the organ in, it involved the entire church.
I'd never sing again, right? If you're saying, well, I could direct my contribution elsewhere, but a person in the congregation said, well, if I'm opposed to the piano and they brought it in, I just never get to sing again. So they'd have to move their membership. So, well, I wanted that one, and then back on that idea of one of the things from the Herald of Truth Memphis meeting. When you said the non-institutionals, they'd get to have their meetings with people they disagreed with, and I asked, would that be a bit confusing for the people in the pew? One of the things that I looked at was Thomas Warren was a speaker, and Batzel Baxter was a speaker, Lynn Anderson was a speaker. Rubel Shelly was at the meeting, I believe. I don't know if he spoke. He was at Whitehaven. But y'all had the meeting in September. And Ira Rice, in his paper, he was totally calling for cut their funds, cut Herald of Truth funds out. But then a month later in October, Thomas Warren and Rubel went to speak on the lectureship at Lubbock with Lynn Anderson and Batzel Barrett Baxter. Do you think that's confusing? That
probably
that a month ago we were saying these people can't be fellowshipped. We're going to cut the funds to their program, but now I'm going to go share the pulpit with them in fellowship.
By the way, a couple of years before he died, Lynn Anderson came to see me.
Okay.
Came to our house here in Henderson, and he was with great-grandson of T.B. Larimore, who's another friend, and I took them to Stantonville, Tennessee, to the grave of Larimore's mother, and they'd never been there, didn't know it was there. One of them, it was his great-great-grandmother. But anyway, I thought Lynn moderated some in his later years. I could be mistaken about that, but that was my feeling.
Okay, well that would be a question of when he came to visit you, I didn't know, would you think you'd be able, the question would be, if you can't worship and work with Lynn Anderson, how could you have that company with him when he came to see you?
Well, he knocked on my door.
And just said, can you take us up here?
Well, he just, at that time, he'd been diagnosed with cancer.
Oh, okay.
And he called this his, I'm trying to remember the expression he used, but it was something like this was his farewell tour, or something to that effect. As a matter of fact, he overcame the cancer and lived some years afterwards. But he wanted to go back to the places that he had been, like Fried Hardeman.
Right.
And so he came by to
I didn't know he had cancer. I had seen photos where he always had oxygen, but I didn't know that he had cancer.
He had it at one time. Seems that he overcame it, or it went into remission or something.
Mm-hmm. Well, still with the Herald of Truth, and I want to ask this. So you had, in '68, you did the Arlington meeting with Reuel Lemmons. And in 1973, you participated in the Memphis meeting, and you'll have notes in here. You were writing reports, and you were sending them to Ira Rice. And there's, right there, that's you. So
I don't think I've seen it. I think he picked it up from something I'd written.
Well, it's a report of the Herald of Truth meeting, September 10th and 11th. And so the evidence is here. I read in the Firm Foundation, you were at the meeting, you spoke at the meeting, the evidence is documented. You had that teamwork with Reuel Lemmons in '68. In the Firm Foundation, Reuel Lemmons wrote in an editorial, and he said, don't listen to the rumors that are coming out of Memphis about the Herald of Truth. And he said, keep sending your money over to Herald of Truth. Did you feel betrayed by that?
First of all, I don't remember that.
Okay.
I'm not denying it occurred. I just don't recall it. But I will say this about Brother Lemmons. He underwent something of a transformation. When he was editor of the Firm Foundation to begin with, he was very conservative. As time went by, he seemed to move a little more to the left. And by the time that he ceased being the editor, he appeared to be in a different frame of mind than he was earlier.
Well, he always called it middle of the road. He said, we want to be in the middle of the road. But by the time in 83, he left Firm Foundation, he started Image, which was a very, very different paper.
Absolutely.
So, I mean,
It's kind of funny to me because if you look at the issues of the Firm Foundation, it becomes rather obvious that Reuel Lemmons was a great admirer of Foy E. Wallace Jr., than whom there was no greater conservative. And he printed articles by Brother Wallace. So it just seems that he underwent something of a change.
well, with that, you said this morning, now, like you said, you don't remember it, but you're not denying that it happened. He wrote that in his editorial. He said, these are just rumors, and when you're trying to do a good thing, there are a lot of politics that get in the way. And so you told something this morning when I'm doing all my research through, this is the Gospel Advocate, 1968, Getwell Road School of Preaching. So I'm looking at the advocates, I'm looking at the Firm Foundations, contending for the faith. And there was this note that I could never find the answer to. And then you said it this morning. I could never figure out how it moved from Getwell to Knight Arnold. How did that happen? Because this morning you said a rumor began that we were going to shut the school down, and it wasn't true. I never could find that in writing.
It probably is not in writing.
I don't think it is. I've looked. So,
Getwell started the School of Preaching. There were actually plans to expand it and to make it more effective. There was even discussion of renting an apartment for Brother Foy Wallace and letting him teach students, not permanently or every semester, but periodically. There was also some discussion about Brother Dixon retiring as president of Freed Hardeman, seeing if he would be interested in coming and helping with the School of Preaching. All that was under discussion. But I think that rattled some of the ones who were in charge that there might be some changes underway. And so the students became convinced. Maybe I can't say altogether how, but they became convinced that we were going to close the school. That was the furthest thing from our mind. We wanted to expand the school and make it more effective. But they were led to believe, some of them had given up jobs and made other sacrifices to be here. They were led to believe that all of that was going to be lost and the school was going to shut down. And apparently that was what was presented to the elders at what was then Knight Arnold, now is Forest Hill. And they agreed to take the school. The elders here were not consulted. They never gave consent. A pickup truck backed up right out here in the parking lot and loaded materials that had been paid for out of the Getwell treasury and moved them to Knight Arnold. And the school moved. Now I will say, to the credit of the Getwell Church and the Getwell elders, that they felt it was a good work. And they did not try to hurt the school. And through the years, they've continued to be supportive.
did the elders at the time, did they mind that the school was moving?
Well, it was not their decision. It moved
They just felt
without
that.
their knowledge or consent. And actually, after it was pointed out to some of the ones who carried it away that they had taken materials that belonged to the Getwell congregation, they did return some of those things, which indicates they knew that it did not belong to them.
Do you know
Maybe some of the books in the library here, I don't remember.
Do you know who started the rumor that the school was closing?
I can't say I know.
Okay. But it definitely...
I have a pretty good idea.
But it was a political move then. Like, that just... It's unbelievable hearing it.
I don't know whether I'd call it a political move. I would say it was a misguided move.
Well, what I'm trying to accomplish too with a lot of these interviews that I'm doing, I think I think that these stories help young men, because a lot of times they go in and they start seeing some of these things and they're like, where is this coming from? But if folk would start paying attention to history, they'd start saying, these things are gonna happen. It's a matter of keeping your head up and kind of paying attention to it. So but right now, this is fantastic that you would do this with us, because they don't know these stories.
That's true.
And so moving from...
I will say this about the School of Preaching. At one time, it developed a reputation of being somewhat radical.
Memphis.
Yes.
Okay.
I can remember some elders saying, don't hire a preacher from the School of Preaching. You'll have problems if you do. When Brother Cates took over as director, Curtis Cates, I think the school became more moderate. And I think over the years, they've done a lot of good.
Well, when you say, one of the things that I think that Curtis Cates, I only had him briefly when I went there. What would be the moderation? Like when they said these people right now, they're radical, don't hire them. But then they start moderating out. How would you describe that? If I can say, when I hear people say radical, I think it's going to be those people who say, we wish you would call less names from the pulpit.
It's a little hard to define specifically, but I think the impression was that some of the young men that came out of the school were so determined to have things their way. And they almost came out with a chip on their shoulder that I think about the story about the old Quaker that said to his wife, no one is right but me and thee. And sometimes I wonder about thee. So that was almost the attitude that some of the young men appeared to manifest. They came out thinking that all the churches were in trouble, all of them were compromising. It was their mission in life to correct all of that. I don't know that that was true. I'm just saying that was the impression people got.
Right.
And I don't think it was so much that way after Brother Cates came and others.
Okay. Well, when my dad went in the 80s, Curtis Cates was the director. Curtis Cates said about atheists, he said, go out, tell them, I'll debate them anytime, anywhere, on any topic. And Garland Elkins and the Knight Arnold elders, they were issuing out debate challenges. So I would hope that when someone hears this interview, that when we say they're moving from radical to more of a moderate, they weren't easing up on debating. In the 80s, they were still pushing to... have
Well,
those debates?
I don't think there's anything wrong with debating. Not anything wrong with debating atheists. And I knew Curtis Cates well. I knew Garland Elkins well. I think they were good men, and they were trying to do the right thing. The problem, as you can tell, is somewhat difficult to define. And I'm talking more about impressions
Than
than
reality.
anything else. That there was the impression left that some of the young preachers that came out of the preacher school before the days of Curtis Cates, that had a kind of a chip on their shoulder attitude. And a lot of congregations were a little bit dubious.
To say, maybe we're not going to hire that fellow just because of where he came from school. Well, I don't really know how long, if we start wrapping up now. You've given us your time, very gracious. Do you mind if we just have a few more moments to go through?
Ahead.
Okay. This, before we met this morning, and again, we did meet just this morning. So again, very gracious to you to let me, I am a brother in Christ, but I'm a stranger. You don't know me from Adam. So thank you for letting me have this time. But
You're dressed different than Adam.
Well, that's true. I am dressed different than Adam. That's very good. But one of the things that you had seen before we met was earlier in the year I did interview Rubel Shelly. And that's a part of the story I think that a lot of people won't know. I brought this paper with me today. This is May 1969. And as the newspaper reports, it says, resignation of Hires. Alan E. Hires has served with the Getwell minister as the minister for nearly 10 years. And when you were resigning, Rubel Shelly was becoming the full-time preacher.
I recommended him.
Did you?
I'm responsible for Rubel coming here.
Now, I knew in '68 he had been fired over at Albany, Mississippi.
New Albany.
New Albany, thank you. Did he come straight from New Albany to Getwell at your recommendation?
My recollection is he was in Knoxville.
Okay.
At the time that he was employed to come here. And the way that I knew Rubel was, Rubel's from a little town called Middleton. I held numerous gospel meetings in Middleton. And in every single one of them, I stayed with Rubel's parents. I loved his father. Brother J.P. Shelly was an elder at Middleton and one of the best men I ever knew. I love Brother Shelly. The first meeting I held at Middleton, and I stayed with the Shelleys, Rubel was in high school. That's how far back we go. And I admired him. I thought he was a young man with tremendous ability. And I followed his career through the years, and when I resigned here, I recommended him. And he came here. There's some interesting stories. For example, when Rubel left New Albany, he decided that he wanted to go to medical school. A lot of people don't know this. But in order to go to medical school, he had to take some pre-med courses that he had not had. So he and Myra moved to Memphis, and he enrolled at what was then called Memphis State, now called University of Memphis. And he was going to take pre-med classes so he could enter medical school. They placed membership at Getwell. I was the preacher. Rubel actually came to me after several weeks or months, and he said, listening to you has made me want to preach again. It's made me want to get in the pulpit. And he gave up the idea of going to med school. and went into preaching. He credited me with that. Now, I'm sure today he probably would not say that, but he told me that at the time.
Right.
Back before he ever moved here, he was holding meetings around in this area. And he asked me, do you mind if I preach some of your sermons in meetings? Again, I don't know that he would say that today, but that actually happened. And of course I told him, no, I don't mind. And I thought very highly of him. I thought he had tremendous ability. I still think he has a great amount of ability. But unfortunately, he went through a very serious change of heart about what he's trying to do.
Now I know, I read a lot of the histories, and so when the 1984 Open Forum happened, you were in charge of the Open Forum. He came one of the days, you gave him 10 minutes from the microphone, and as you all had that back and forth, and he was displaying his opinions at the time, he was saying that I think there will be Christians inside denominations. He said, I'm not going to have membership at a congregation that uses a piano. He said, but I'm also not going to I'm not going to stop calling them brethren. So what would you say to a young person who gets a hold of the forum, they hear Rubel, and then they ask of you, they would say, why is it that Alexander Campbell gets praise, and he wrote the Lunenburg letters, where he said there are Christians in denominations, and we praise Alexander Campbell, but when Rubel Shelly said something similar, he started getting moved out?
Well, first of all, there's a difference. I don't know anyone who denies, I'm sure there are some, that there can be Christians in the denominations. I don't think they're faithful, but I think it's possible. For example, suppose somebody's a member of the church, let's say a man, he marries a woman that's a member of a denomination, he goes with her. Maybe he joins that denomination. He's a member of the church, he's a Christian, but he's in a denomination. He shouldn't be there, but he is. So I don't know of anyone who denies that there could be Christians in a denomination. But here's the difference. The statement that Rubel made was, there are sincere, knowledgeable Christians in every denomination. Now that's a different story. I think there may be Christians in denominations who are not knowledgeable, who don't understand the truth, but he made the affirmation that they can be knowledgeable Christians in a denomination. That's why he got in trouble.
Okay. Well, and then what would you say about Alexander Campbell? My reading of Alexander Campbell, I don't think that he would have been making the statement of, these are people that we taught, and then they went back to their sect. When I read his series, it would look like Alexander was saying, no, there are people out there and they have obeyed the gospel despite whatever that denomination is. So would that be different than what Rubel was saying?
Well, I've written on the Lunenburg letter.
And I have read that.
Okay. I don't think they're the same.
Okay. And then another one would be, what about Rubel? Because his positions have changed. Since 1984, Rubel has changed. So he said, I wouldn't stay in a congregation that had a piano, but I'm not going to refuse to call them brethren. Would that not be similar to J.W. McGarvey's position? We continue to praise J.W. McGarvey, but then it seems like, what if someone said, well, it looks like Rubel got in the same trouble for holding McGarvey's position? What would you say to that?
Have you ever read the statement of J.W. McGarvey that he made to Jesse P. Sewell at Pearl and Bryan in Dallas?
Where he said, I don't think I did any good or hurt the younger generation by giving that.
He said, I tried to go along with error. I thought that was the way to correct it. I was wrong. It didn't work. He told Brother Sewell, you're on the right track. Don't change.
Yeah.
I think that is a very telling statement.
Well, with that quote in place, his thought on it, one thing that I just would like to ask, and you may just say what he said. In 1984, Rubel was 39 and you were 46. Have you ever looked back and wondered, could there have been a different way? Was he just set on a course?
You're talking about at the open forum?
Yes, sir. And he showed up and he requested 10 minutes.
Well, what happened there was, the day before he came, I had a question. I've forgotten precisely what it was, but it related to Rubel's statement that there are sincere, devout, knowledgeable Christians in every denomination. Rubel's name was not called, but the statement was read.
Right.
And comments were made about it. Word got back to him. Rubel has never lacked for self-confidence. And so he made a trip down to Henderson to the forum. He wanted to be up on the platform. He likes to take charge, but I didn't allow that. I was the moderator of the forum. I did give him time, though, to stand up and make whatever statement he wanted to make.
You did give him quite a bit of time.
Yes.
And a microphone. I mean, plenty of people would have told him, take a hike. And you let him have his moment. And before everybody, then some other people came to the microphone.
You know, he said something in that meeting, though, that turned out to be a disappointment to me. He said in that meeting, in the forum, that he believed one had to be baptized for the remission of sins. And I questioned him about that because I understood that he accepted some form of denominational baptism. He got back home and wrote an article in his bulletin that completely contradicted what he said in the forum. I thought he tried to mislead me. Oh. I was disappointed in him.
Right. Well, I remember I read the forum, listened to the forum, and I do remember the part where both of y'all came down to for the remission of sins.
Yeah.
And he was saying the phrase, well, they don't have to understand that if they understand over here, Mark 16:16, be saved. And then even you said, they're the same thing. If I'm doing it to be saved, it's for the remission of sins. So there will be some talking past each other on that. But I'm glad that we could have just a discussion, the history, and even what you said about his dad. We both know he's going to appreciate what you said about his father. But that
maybe.
That book that he wrote, Just a Christian, it was dedicated to his father.
I don't think has very many kind feelings toward me anymore.
Well,
when his mother passed away, I went to her funeral in Middleton, and both of Rubel's brothers came and put their arms around my neck, thanked me for coming. Rubel never spoke to me, never came over where I was, and it made me feel that he had hard feelings. I've criticized him, no question about it.
He's criticized
I thought
you.
he was wrong.
Right. Do you remember what year that would have been?
No.
No. I wouldn't know
Both
that.
of his brothers have died. He's the last one. They were good men. One of them was an elder in the same congregation where their father had been an elder. I thought it was interesting what Rubel said at the funeral, and it's quite true. He said, my mother had 3 only children because they were so different. The oldest was Harry Shelly. The middle one was J.P. Shelly, had red hair. A lot of people called him Red. And Rubel was the youngest of the 3 boys. he said his mother had 3 only children. Those boys were as different as they could be in appearance and looks.
Yeah.
They were several years apart in age, and sometimes it was hard to believe they could be brothers. But Harry was an elder. J.P. led the singing, and both of them were good friends of mine. I introduced J.P. to his wife. His first wife left him for someone else. And I told him about a wonderful girl who was a member at Getwell. And she had a daughter. She had a scriptural divorce. And I talked to J.P. about her. And he came to Memphis and met her, and they married, and were married for several years. But I'm the one that introduced J.P. to his wife.
That's good. There's probably no telling amount of stories that you would have. Well, we were getting the wrap-up signal, but I could ask you one more, she said. Your book that you wrote in response to Rubel, How Do You Spell Fellowship? It's going to turn 40 years old in 2025. You wrote it shortly after the Open Forum, copyright 1985, so it's set to have its 40th anniversary.
I'll tell you, when I wrote that, Freed Hardeman used to have not the Open Forum, but they used to have a special meeting that I guess you could call a forum. They'd have it on different controversial subjects. And one year, they had it on fellowship, and Rubel was one of the speakers, and I was one of the speakers. And I wrote that from the notes that I studied for that meeting.
Was that before, for Rubel, for him to be involved, was it after 84 or before 84?
I think it was after.
Okay. Well, you have quotes from his book all through here, and then, of course, it was written the year afterwards. Well, with it turning 40, I would say people need to read it. Fellowship is a very, very big problem that we're having right now. And with all the different events that we're having and all the different speakers, programs have gotten so big that it is hard to keep up.
The reason it's called How Do You Spell Fellowship, you notice on the front cover, there's a capital F and a little f. That was Rubel's
uppercase
way of referring to it. He would say that he had little f fellowship with some people that he didn't have capital F fellowship with. So I call my little book, How Do You Spell Fellowship?
Well, a question about it, and I don't know if you know, but at the beginning of our discussion, one of the 3 schools that you said had really drifted out to the left is Pepperdine. In February of 2023, the Freed Hardeman lectures had 4 Pepperdine speakers. Would you call that little F fellowship? That there's clearly a difference in beliefs, and yet they get to come have fellowship at the Freed Hardeman lectures.
Well, number one, I have no idea.
It would be Bruce McClarty, Noel Whitlock, Dale Maynor, and then a very young man named David Skidmore. But they
I know 3 of the 4 you just named.
Okay.
And I wouldn't have a question about any of them.
Okay.
Bruce McClarty is back with Freed Hardeman.
Right. He's their minister in residence.
He was president of Harding.
Yes, sir.
And they dismissed him.
During kind of the COVID season.
Yeah, I think he didn't raise enough money is what I honestly think happened.
That's what it was.
But he's a good man.
In 2012, I believe it was, he spoke on the Pepperdine lectures, and essentially because of his last name, when you look at their program, there's Bruce McClarty, and then there was a woman, and she's quite prominent in the Abilene community. Bruce McClarty, and then right beside him would be Amy McLaughlin. She's a woman preacher. So is it not a problem that he's going to speak out there and they've got women preachers on the program with him?
Not necessarily. You know, if I were invited to speak somewhere and had the opportunity to present truth, I wouldn't necessarily decline because there was someone on there that I didn't agree with.
And so she's going to call herself a member of the church. Bruce McClarty's a member of the church. Do you think he has any responsibility to speak out against their use of women preachers while he's there?
Everything depends on the situation, circumstances. Under some conditions, yes.
Okay.
Maybe under others, not so much.
Would you say that there might be some conditions where it would be uncouth?
I think Bruce McLarty is very conservative.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think his position would be in question.
Okay.
The fact that he was on the program with somebody who was otherwise would not necessarily implicate him.
Okay. Well,
Dale Manor, his specialty is archaeology.
right.
And his father was a friend of mine, Curtis Manor. Curtis preached in San Diego. I held a meeting with him out there. And I've known Dale most of his life, I guess.
Well, I knew their different backgrounds and associations, but that's something that I had seen and taken notice of was that they would frequent Pepperdine, and a lot of Pepperdine people now come to Oklahoma Christian. And so, but with this book turning...
I got criticized for speaking at Lipscomb. Although it was not on the Lipscomb lectures, it was during the Lipscomb lectures. 21st Century Christian invited me to speak at their luncheon.
When was this? Do you remember?
No, I don't
Okay.
remember. But they had a luncheon during the Lipscomb lectures, and they asked me to be the speaker. And they asked me to talk about, I can't remember how it was worded, but it had to do with instrumental music and how it got introduced and so on. And I talked about Lipscomb and how Lipscomb listed the church separately from the Christian church in 1906 in the United States Census. And Willard Collins came to that luncheon and sat at the table with me, and he remarked, "I only came to hear you." So I appreciated that. But anyway, after that was over, I think maybe in the Gospel Guardian they wrote me up pretty good, you know, for speaking at the Lipscomb lectures.
Right.
And I pointed out I wasn't on the lectureship. I spoke at a luncheon for 21st Century Christian. But you could ask me the same question, well, did you criticize all these people you didn't agree with? No, but I presented the truth on what they asked me to speak about.
Right. Well, all of this, like I said, your book will have its 40th anniversary. I was able to get a copy. I think people ought to check it out. And, you know,
if they can find it.
If they can find it, and but I do think by and large, my generation needs to start paying attention to history more. I believe that history repeats itself, and so we need to be aware. And so you have certainly helped out this morning, fill in a lot of blanks for a lot of people.
I'm working on the October issue of the Spiritual Sword. It's late because we usually get it out before the first of the month, but it's going to be on instrumental music. And one thing that I have in there that I think you will enjoy is the voice of the pioneers. And I quote Campbell and Lard and McGarvey and others. And their quotations are really quite interesting.
They will be, and I'll look forward to that when it comes out. Mr. Allen, I have to say, you've given me so much time. I don't want your wife to be mad at me. So you have been very gracious with us.
Well, thank you
Thank
very
you
much.
very much for taking the time.
I was reluctant to do this.
Well, you just will never know how thankful I am. It means a lot to me. Thank you.
All right, you all.
Thank you.
Be gentle.
And when it's done, I'll share it with you,
Okay.
and so you can see it.
Great.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Good to meet you.
You too. Yeah. Here, I'll get your microphone. You know, there was one question I wanted to ask you and I didn't get to. You remember Leroy Garrett?
Oh, absolutely.
You remember?
No kidding story.
Do you remember you were going that? I wish I had all day. You were going into school in 1955.
Yes.
And they had just arrested him.
They put him in jail in Henderson.
In February. So you were coming into school right off the heels of that.
Well, I've been to Leroy Garrett's house.
I know that. He wrote about it.
I spoke in Denton, Texas, and that's where he lived. And I wanted him to autograph his book on church history, and I went out to his house and visited with him and got him to autograph my book.
How was he in person?
Oh, he was a very congenial sort of fellow. Leroy was kind of a sad story in a way. You know, he was a Harvard graduate.
Yes, sir.
Very smart. But he was a disciple of Carl Ketcherside. And I used to say, wherever Carl went, Leroy was sure to go. When Ketcherside was radical, Leroy was radical. When Ketcherside became liberal, Leroy became liberal. When I was graduating from high school, I drove to Dallas to the Preston Road Church, I think. Guy N. Woods was in a debate with Leroy Garrett, and I heard them debate.
Wow.
And
well, as a lawyer, I would want to ask you, in 1955, do you think they had legal grounds to arrest him? Or did they make a bad move?
well, in retrospect, it might have been a bad move. They say the jail, which is no longer there, in Henderson was a filthy
Right.
place.
Well,
And they arrested him and put him in jail. And of course, he thrived on that for years. Wrote about it, complained about it, and so on. And
he said they put him in jail with the meanest man in town. But the cook was out, so the police had to take him to a restaurant to get his dinner, and he called his wife, and he said, "Honey, I'm in jail." She said, "How are you calling me from a restaurant if you're in jail?"
well, what happened was Brother Dixon, who was president of Freed Artiment, forbade him going into the dorm. Told him that was trespassing. And of course Leroy went anyway, and met with boys and tried to, convert them and persuade them and all of that. And that's when Brother Dixon called the police and said he's trespassing.
Right.
So technically he was. So, it was a legitimate arrest, but probably was not a very good idea.
Well, everybody across the board, I try to look at everybody's story, but your wife is ready to go. Y'all giving us so much time. This has been so good.
Well, I got
Let me
lots
shake
of
your hand
stories
on
I haven't told.